there is the shift that I mentioned this morning with the Santa Cruz students, that it looks like if you use psychedelics in any kind of consistent way, you end up using them for serious purposes. And that's inherently beneficial to the culture. And I was thinking this morning, how many of you would say, because of your own psychedelic experiences, that you're better people? Okay? Now, I know it's a kind of loaded question, but the hands went up really fast. Okay, and yes, I'm just a lot nicer. I'm a lot closer to other human beings, and a lot of other nice things. And I admit I have not been deeply involved in therapeutic psychedelics since they were illegal. But they're used to better relationships. And also they're used to love nature. And although it's a little hard if you look out the windows here to think that there is a natural world, we all know there is. And we all know that that the data, the studies that say if you can take someone out in nature, they're going to feel better. And there's wonderful studies of taking children who are in the disturbed classes for the difficult students, and you simply give them a nature walk, that they will behave better in school for up to 2 weeks. Okay? There's a wonderful study in Chicago of 2 projects, one built around a courtyard and one not. The courtyard was nothing that people in California would admire, but it had trees and it had a bench and it had some plants. The crime rate in that building with a courtyard was less than the identical amount of apartments, one building over. So we all know that. And if there's any way to get people more aware of nature, it's psychedelics. And someone was telling me a wonderful story of going out into nature with their father. And he was carrying a gun because he was a hunter. But that day, they both dosed with psilocybin and sat and appreciated nature together. Now, scientific exploration is doing all kinds of wonderful things, and a lot of it out of the Beckley world, out of England. But neuroscience is now incredibly in. And there's a wonderful study, I think it might have been Science Daily that I also like very much, where if you take a science-y article, and the way they do theirs is there's a science-y article and then there's a little illustration in one fifth of the page. And it turns out if you take the same article, but you run it either with a picture of anything or a picture of a brain. If you put a picture of a brain in, it could be about, chocolate rabbits or a new moss found in South Dakota. If you put a brain in there, you get 20% more hits. Okay? So the brain at the moment is a brand. And the next generation is filled with people who want to do psychedelic research. We put together a listserv a few years ago with maps that graduate students, it's a graduate student listserv. And to get on it, you had to have come out, so to speak. You had to have either published, written a paper to an editor, made a class presentation, but done something that said, I'm really interested in psychedelics. And it has hundreds of members from just all over the world. I'm just looking here because they're having a meetup tonight, and I won't tell you where. But who am I looking at? Psychology, clinical psychology, communication, anthropology, clinical psychology, philosophy, spiritual care, neuroscience, English literary studies. And if I look at where they're from, CIIS, New York University, University of California, University of Queensland, New York, Foxhall Graduate School in Yeshiva University, Lindenwood University, Harvard, Northwestern, Utah. And then there's a university I can't pronounce in Delhi. That's the next generation of researchers. These are all graduate students with amazing amounts of scientific background, most of them. And that's who's coming up. This is the last time in the history of humanity you're going to be able to see almost every important psychedelic researcher in one place, because there are too many coming up. That's a wonderful problem. Cultural acceptance. I begin lots of my talks, particularly in places that don't know what to do with me, by saying 26 million Americans have taken LSD since it became illegal. And that 26 million is more in the top 50% of education than below. So when you have a book, and I've had this psychedelic explorer book for a while, early on you have a certain prostitution mentality where you're buying an aspirin and you say, "Hi, by the way, I have this book." And if you're sitting next to someone on an airplane, "Hi, I know you don't want to talk to anybody, but I have this book." And what I found, of course, is a lot more people than I would have thought, dressed differently than I would have thought, and so forth, are open to it. And I remember very, very much being on a plane, and I said, "Hello, I'm a prostitute. I will sell you my book." And this person looked at me like they would like to squish me between their feet, and that they had just come from South America where they were stealing something for a major bank. And then there was this glazed look that happened, that out of focus look. I remember once in college, I was running down the street at 2 a.m, naked. And I was yelling, "Why are you all hiding in your clothes?" And then the glaze went away. I don't think he took the book. But that's who's running the world. Okay? Those 26 million people are you and a lot of people who are not here. And the Burning Man festivals and the nonprofits and the food farmers and the journalists, almost the people you deal with in a positive way of all are psychedelic graduates of one form or another. Now, what's the negative? What are some of the things to look for? And there's something called a ghost trap. Now, there's a version of it in America, but the one I'm thinking about is in Tibet. There's a ghost trap, and you use it for capturing ghosts, and it has a geometric pattern where a ghost gets lost, and it has little cotton tufts on the edges. And if the cotton is wet in the morning, there's a ghost in there. And the nice thing you can do this easily in Tibet is you take it and you then throw it down some crevasse that's 1,000 feet deep. One of the ghosts lives in the shadow of a great success. A great success, like anything else, casts a shadow, and there are certain ghosts that live in that shadow. And it's, since we're not Tibetans and we don't know quite how to get rid of those ghosts, I suggest you be aware of the ghosts because we're at the moment having a great success. This is, this whole conference is a great edifice, and we need to think about the ghost traps. And what are we looking at? Synthetic. That company that makes fentanyl, the Roundup Ready cannabis, right? That Monsanto works with cannabis and finds one, because cannabis growing it is not easy. It's prey to lots of things. There are some sane bills in Congress, really sane bills about marijuana. But we also have the Attorney General. And on the psychodynamic kind of worldview, we have we still have the fear. Psychedelics still frighten people because, as we know, they affect the way you behave in the culture and so forth. I'm kind of hoping that Sessions is just ignorant and mean-spirited. My concern is that he's a pleasure hater. Another ghost is the pharmaceutical industry. In my 2010, 2011 book, I have a session that says, if you look at where we're doing the research, the clinical research, we're doing it with people that the medical profession doesn't like. People who don't get better. You know, some of you are physicians and psychiatrists, and you know what it's like. When you have someone who really doesn't get better, it's hard to feel good about them because they are saying, you're a failure. In fact, there's a wonderful term called treatment resistant, meaning it's their fault. I love it. But if you're taking people who are dying of cancer and are anxious and unhappy and making everyone around them unhappy, and you come in and say, well, I'd love these people to come and do our study, you get total support. And the early research, if you look at it carefully, was all done with groups that nobody wanted. However, one of the things we're finding now, there's research with ayahuasca and psilocybin and with microdosing, that it looks like, and with ketamine, it looks like that all of these substances are good for depression. What's the most, not popular, that's the wrong word, the most common mental illness on the planet is either realism or depression, depending on how you look at it. But if we call it depression, it's treated pharmaceutically. If we call it realism, we hopefully do something different. But we have a massive pharmaceutical industry based on addicting people to antidepressants. What if you said, well, instead of taking an antidepressant that works or not for the rest of your life, you microdose or you take a higher dose of one of these substances? That's a serious threat to one of the most powerful groups of companies on the planet. You know what's happened to where the other powerful group, the petrochemical people, you know what they've been doing. So I'm saying this not in a fear-mongering way, but I think being aware that the pharmaceutical industry, I would like to find some way where they could profit, because that would protect us. So that's the kind of thing that I'm looking at. And one of the questions is, how are we building a future worth living in? And the answer is, as a subculture, we're doing quite well. As a culture, not so well, and as a whole world, quite poorly. And we have a lot that we can individually do, and a lot that we can do collectively. And one of the shifts for me, one of the things that surprised me, is another book called Cannabis and Spirituality, An Explorer's Guide to a Truly Ancient Plant Spirit Ally. Now, I'm prone to books that say Explorer's Guide in them. And Stephen Gray is a wonderful human being who edited and wrote a number of the articles. But it didn't really occur to me how cannabis was seriously an entheogen. And in terms of things to look at, and Stephen will be talking at the symposia, I strongly recommend you think about that, because it isn't the way most of us have been smoking, or vaping, or edibling, or whatever we call it. The other is, Tom mentioned the book by, I think it was Greenspoon, the 1976 book. Don Lattin has a new book where he's looking at what's happening right now. It's not as academic and doesn't have a huge, wonderful annotated index. But it's another book about a lot of the things that are going on in a very useful way. So there's also a new generation of guides. See, I'm kind of in the psychedelic world. I'm a right-wing guide person, which is I really think that high doses. I'm a guy that says you just got to have a designated driver if you drink. So think you should have a designated guide if you're interested in seeing God and not getting in trouble. And what I'm seeing is there's another generation of guides coming up. There's trainings, not visible, not legal. There's competent people. There's manuals. There's a whole world coming up of helpers. And it may be a little bit like hospice. See, when hospice first started, nobody liked, it was against the system. That wasn't medicine. And it was started by one person, one nurse, who was in a hospital and working with someone who was dying and they fell in love with each other. And she made dying as comfortable as she could for him, which was very, very hard. And then she wanted to make a difference. And she realized, as a nurse, she had no power in the medical system. So she became a doctor. And her vision, this is what I love about this, her vision was to have one ward somewhere where she could be the doctor on a ward to help people die well. She had no vision of an international hospice system, of palliative care, of changing the nature of much of medicine to help people die well. Any of us may be that nurse, doing something small and something personal and something that we need to do. And I hope to be around long enough to appreciate what a lot of you are going to be creating. Thank you. So we want to really open it up to discussion. And probably somewhat question and answery because we both have mics and you only have one. But let's see what we can do. But let's just take a moment. Let's just take a moment and get present and remember who we are. And if just this is my favorite command of all things spiritual. Sit in a comfortable position. Now, I don't really want to do that to you, so please sit in an uncomfortable position like you were. Okay, so awareness is really very simple. You start with that. This is the box you came in, whether you like it or not. And in a comfortable position, just think a little bit about the whole day. We've really covered many, many topics. This is not a unified workshop. This is not holotropic breathing. This is not the Mittendorfer's training. This is simply looking at the culture in a number of different ways and a number of different possibilities. And the question, given the amount of intelligence and talent that you are, is what we want to look at as well. And I realize I have two small, totally personal info commercials. So be alert. One is, I asked you for reports. I want to underscore how important that is. The next piece for me probably will be a book, and it will be a book of predominantly quotes that you heard this morning. It will be what is, the way I look at it is we started with a blank map because nobody knew about microdosing except the thousands of indigenous people that knew a lot, but I didn't know that. And so I've been filling in that map over the years. And there's a lot of holes in that map, and a lot of you know about what's in some of those holes, but I don't know that. So again, my personal email is jfadiman@gmail.com. And anything that you can do I can amplify what you're doing, and you'll get more leverage out of it. And so that's what we're doing. So that's one info commercial. The other is, after 5 years of self-funding, I'm aware that it would be very helpful if people helped fund this piece of the research. And I wrote Rick last week and said, would MAPS like to be the place to run funds through? I said, I have a nonprofit I can use, and I don't want to do anything to bother your political, strategy. And he wrote back, as only Rick could do. He said, I'd be very happy to be the funder. And how many funders have you got? I wrote back, none. But if any of you would like to support microdose research, the microdose research team not only is grateful, but would then be able to hire an assistant for our researcher, and we can just move a lot faster and get a lot more done. So, and I'm going to probably pitch that tomorrow as well, so you can turn off when you hear it again. Okay, now let's get back to where we were. We spent a whole day. Questions, comments. If you're going to do a comment, make it short. If you're going to do a question, you know the rules.
Jim, are you interested in physical treatment, like neurogenic pain, microdosing, more mental acuity, or it's just anything and everything?
Well, the thing that we've learned about microdosing, and here's this kind of simple truth. There's a notion when we take into our bodies a substance that's a psychedelic, that it all goes to your brain. That's obviously not true. It goes into your bloodstream. It goes to every cell in your body. Now, what we're finding with microdosing is, and with marijuana, is that lots of parts of your body respond in ways that are very exciting. I mean, in marijuana, for example, if you have neuropathy, if your feet hurt, why is marijuana good for you? Well, obviously, it goes not only to your brain, but to the rest of your body. So the question with microdosing, which is the area I'm most interested in, is everything. Because when I read you that woman from Europe, she covered almost every area that has happened, and a lot of it has been surprises. And my talk tomorrow ends with just some far out stuff. So yes, all of it. And if you write short, that's great. If you write long, that's great. And we're going to get to you whether there's a mic or not. Okay? Yes?
This question's in regard to microdosing. In some of the anecdotal stories that you were relating, it sounded like there was a kind of a progression in people's experiences. And in Ayelet Waldman's book also, she seems to be on an ascent basically throughout her month. And I'm wondering if you've found that there's a plateau, or if not, what's the upper limit of this experience?
Well, there's the question, if I can reframe it slightly, is it's like if you take certain substances every day, the effect goes away and you take it again. And you basically get to the same place every day. There are other substances where there's a cumulative effect, which is more toward cure. And microdoses seem to be somewhere in the middle of that, which is, I did mention that by the 10th cycle, people's third day seems to be similar to their other days. We don't know enough at this point to know long-term effects. I do have a couple of people who've been microdosing for over 10 years. They're fine. And when I was in Santa Barbara, someone told me he'd been microdosing for 49 years. And he was in his 80s, and he was teaching yoga and also doing sculpture. But he might have been doing that without that, for all we know. So the answer is, it looks like it has a cumulative effect, and it may not. And the nice thing is that's a hard question, which if you look in the drug literature, about almost anything, they have no idea. Because most research in drugs is very short term. 6 weeks follow-up is like an amazing event. And we're talking about a very different situation here. I will tell you that most people who microdose regularly for that month microdose less afterwards. So, yes, please, in the front here. We're getting to you. There we go.
Thank you. I'd like to bring it back to something you said earlier, which when you were talking about Timmy and the multiple personalities.
Yes, Timmy likes orange juice, right?
Yes. Where do you think that the disconnect is between you and I? Obviously, we all can have those multiple personalities rather than somebody who's in an institution.
Now, the question is, I got a little confused. We're a little
So-
too interesting.
Since we're all
We're all multiples.
right.
Are
who
we
says-
like Timmy?
Well, who decides, I guess, what is the disconnect from somebody in the institution who needs psychotherapy the rest of their lives or somebody considered normal like us?
Oh, you mean how do you get from normal multiple to
Right.
abnormal multiple?
Yes.
Usually, the distinction is that the memories are not shared.
Connectivity.
It may be.
Okay.
But one of the things is the memory, you see it both in fiction and in biography. I woke up 2 days later and I didn't know where I was. And I turned over and there was some stranger in my bed. Okay, somebody did that. It wasn't that you vanished and reappeared 2 days later. Somebody was busy living those 2 days and picked up that other person and went to bed with them. But the memories are not shared. Okay? We have a term blacking out. Come on. We're not blacking out because during the period we're blacked out, things happen. We also have it with drugs. One of the drugs that I'm not fond of are this group called the N-bombs, N-B-O-M, etc. Because at a higher dose, people disassociate and do things like drive into trees on purpose. And then when they wake up in the hospital, they say, I didn't mean to do that. Okay? We have Ajax, or people who, quote, lose it. So it's, when you take an abnormal psychology course, you begin to realize there's a very vague line between where they say you're abnormal, and it usually means that you're making some kind of trouble in the culture. For instance, high-functioning autism are very successful in many parts of the culture. That's why we have so many wonderful programmers and coders. But they're not successful in other parts of the culture, but we've now got a culture which has a real place for them. Just as if you're, hunters and gatherer cultures have different specialists, some of whom don't do well. Certain, quote, learning difficulties. Learning difficulties usually mean you can't sit still in class. Well, if you're in a hunting-gathering society, nobody ever does. It's not an issue. But your ability to focus insanely, closely, in a hunting and gathering society usually makes you a leader. Here it makes you somebody where they're afraid you're going to lose your life in video games. So the distinction is quite difficult to make. And that's why I try and define mental illness. It's a little bit like in your garden, what's a weed and what's a flower? Is you're God, you decide. This year, you're a weed. So wait a moment, last year I was a spice. I was an herb. What happened? I lost interest in sage. Okay, whatever it is. So cultures also change about what's true or not. And one of the things about transpersonal psychology, which is my background, is we're looking at the whole expanse of human behavior. And if we look at saints through say, a Freudian lens, they're all sick. But if we look at them through a spiritual experience lens, they are the highest beings in the culture.
Thank you.
Take it whatever it is.
If there was somebody who has been in therapy for over 30 years, taking Abilify for 2 years and Prozac for 25, and they really were serious about embarking microdosing to alleviate their depression, what would be the best method for that person now? Because I know you have to get off SSRIs and...
Tom and I agreed he would answer the next question no matter what it was. Tom?
I wish I knew.
I asked him earlier.
You know, the answer is when someone has been ill a day or 30 years and we have something that uses a different pathway, we try it.
So her question is how? Because she's totally unfamiliar, never, just totally...
Oh, if she doesn't want to do it, then that's it. We
No,
ended
she
it.
does. She just doesn't know.
Yeah, well, that's fine. Then find her,
Methods, I guess.
I don't really want to be filmed saying, fine, she should just find a nice psychedelic and use it.
And that's not the approach at all.
That may be appropriate if one knows the person. But one of the things about not knowing people, I got a letter from someone who said, how are microdoses for geriatrics? And I thought, so I wrote back and said, it depends. What's your age? 59. And I thought, oh, to be 59 again. And then the symptoms were all horrible. So it wasn't at all about age. It had nothing to do with it. Okay? One of the things, and you all who are psychotherapists know, is the presenting question is not the presenting problem. The presenting question is to find out if you can be trusted. Then you get the presenting problem. And it's just as true with people who ask about psychedelics. And if the question is, well, how can I get someone who doesn't know anything about psychedelics to take psychedelics? And the answer is the same way probably you get people interested in going to bed with you who aren't. You kind of use all your skills. Tom really should have answered that one. Okay.
Thanks.
A comment and a question. Comment first, thank you for your work to the both of you. And the question is, being very different, how can we learn from the already existing psychedelic cultures out there in the Amazon, for example?
Did you get that?
No.
The indigenous people you mentioned,
Oh,
for
indigenous
instance.
people, right.
I see them as a culture that is functioning very well and is built or deeply rooted in the work of psychedelics.
Right.
So how can we, our culture, learn from
How
that?
can we become deeply rooted in psychedelics as well, the kind of way an indigenous culture is?
Not really, because that was what all the day was about, I guess. How can we transfer what they already
How
have?
can we adapt?
What can we adapt?
Yeah.
How can we adapt being so different?
I don't know if there's any question other than to try various things, because set and setting are so important, and setting our cultural issues. There's no way we should expect to be able to adopt their procedures and they would necessarily fit us, but some will and some won't, and that's the question. There's a great field of sort of ethnographic, comparative anthropology, something or other to be developed. Because their routines are not right for us, and our routines are not right for them. No, some of them might be. That's the problem. We have to just look at them, and it'll vary from culture to culture. And in our culture, who will be willing to adapt what from where? I'm seeing that's an enormous problem. I don't have any solution for it other than trying it out. I don't think we can wholesalely adopt anybody, any of the other cultures. Now, some things will be adoptable, but I don't know which.
Maria Sabina, who was the woman who introduced mushrooms back into Western civilization from her position in Mexico, said until the gringos came, nobody had ever asked her to see God. People came to get healing and divination. They wanted information and they wanted healing. Then the gringos show up and we want to see, we want to have an ecstatic experience. And she was ill-equipped to handle it. And her life was pretty well destroyed by Gordon Wasson's introduction, visiting her. Including the village at some point burned her house down. They didn't like the way things had been going. So the question of cultural shift is an interesting one. I was thinking, does anyone remember what coffee and tea were for? They were for all-night prayer. Now, when's the last time, right? You put on a cup, a pot of coffee to get for your all-night prayer. So cultures take in substances and make changes that fit that culture. And we're beginning to do that now. And I think that the churches are one way, because churches are a place where our culture kind of knows how to do that. And that's why the cannabis church is an interesting, or the Rastafarian is an interesting shift. And we don't know. But certainly, this conference is a cultural event of its own sort. 45 states, 40 countries. That's a pretty amazing cultural shift where everyone's going to go back to somewhere and see what they can do to make their personal subculture a safer, happier, better place. And if everybody does that, there's a term, I think Goethe says it, if everyone in the world sweeps their front porch, the world is cleaned. So I guess my personal stuff is, what can you do in your own, in the smallest possible unit you have? And I really admire Cecily, and I don't remember her last name, this is the woman who started hospice, which is, the other way is, from a very Christian point of view, is what does God request of you, not require. And there's a wonderful story of Elmer Green, one of the early biofeedback researchers. And he was a young graduate student. He was getting his first job, and he was deeply involved in some very complicated spiritual groups. And he asked help from the spirit guide for his next job. And he got a vision of some buildings, and he said, where are those? And they said, it's in the Midwest. And he said he really wanted to go to California. And the being said, you're being offered this job. And he said, but what if I don't take it? And the being said, we'll offer it to someone else. Oh. He was at Menninger for 30 years. And there's this wonderful notion that, we get into this arrogance. Well, God has asked me to set up the nonprofit foundation to sell chocolate-infused ayahuasca in Peru. And God may have done that, but if you don't want to do that, God says, well, I've got a lot of other people. I know everyone. So I guess my question is not, ask not what you can do, just ask if you're made an offer, see if you're willing to take it. And don't be afraid to quit. Yes, please. Yes. Did our microphone, Elliot, can you move that microphone?
Hi. So I just wanted to make a comment and a question.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, thanks a lot for the combination of both of you. What you said about Tom being a big thinker and you being more practical, I think it worked out really nice. I tend to be more like Tom. So, and this Entheogen is really why I came here for. Now I have a language, which is really cool. I'm more into the paradigm shift of sustainability in the 21st century. So all of this sustainable development goals and all of this. And I came here to explore ways of kind of how to reach there, tools. And I learned today microdosing can actually be a really powerful one. So my question is more on, I work in the science policy interface, and I work with politicians in Europe, and also in Portugal, because I'm Portuguese. So I'm interested in how did you approach people that can be very conservative, high level, with the fact of, trying to attract them for microdosing. And another one is how do you see virtual reality coming into all of this as eventually a tool that could catalyze things? For both of you, please.
The three freedoms really is a lovely way to open a discussion. I particularly like the three freedoms when I was on a right-wing Christian show, which was not exactly drug-friendly. But they had nothing to say except those are wonderful freedoms. And my feeling is also, you say to people, I don't think people should suffer unnecessary pain. How do you feel? Okay, and that's where you start, which is, can we alleviate pain? Can we increase freedom? And let's agree to that before we talk details. Now, we do have politicians who will say, I am determined that more people will die if I get my legislation passed. We do have those, okay? We just had a whole round of them. And they are elected, and that's something to think about. But when I work with leaders or if I work with companies, I really start there. And it's, again, very hard for people to say, I want people to suffer, I want people to die in pain. And they say, and then the next is, well, there isn't any science. And they say, well, how about then making rules to encourage the science? Oh. That would illuminate my excuse. I mean, I still get this, the question with microdosing is, there's been no double-blind, randomized tests yet. How do you know it has an effect? And the answer is, if my research was hitting people over the head with a 2x4, you wouldn't ask that question. You didn't say, well, can't we have two groups? One you hit over the head with a 2x4 and the other you don't. And can they tell the difference? So it's a really, my example is really stupid. And so is yours. So I don't win a lot of friends among those people, but those people aren't my friends. And people have their own we all have our own limitations where we say, I need such and such before I can. And usually that's very sensible and sane, and to get people off of that is you have to go bigger, which is why I say 3 freedoms and don't have people suffer. Or I would like it if my mother was ill to be able to lower her pain. How do you feel about for your mother? Actually, you've got to watch that one. How do you feel about a relative?
I want to add to that too. In working with people who have a negative view of psychedelics, I find it helpful to realize that some people have to be exposed to an idea 2, 3, or 4 times. And this may be exposure 1 or 2, and they won't be accepted, but you're setting the gate open for numbers 3 and 4. And that I'm that way myself, so I recognize that in people. Also, in presenting them information, don't come with a wheelbarrow, just come with 1 piece of paper or 1 question. Or, do you think this would work? Particularly working with professors. Professors love questions. So if you can present them with a question, do you think, and one of the things professors always want to do is to be able to apply their area of knowledge to a new area. So you can say, what do you think our our area of interest would have to say about psychedelics or understand psychedelics, because then you're giving more richness to his area of specialty. In presenting paper with information to people, take a good, like an article from Scientific America or Science or New York Times or The Economist, and then present them with one article. Don't give them a pile of articles. You can put a pile of articles away. It's hard to put one article away. So, you're working slowly with them, and that's the way a lot of people work. And really, if you look at this conference, in terms of the number of people here, this has happened slowly, and progress often happens slowly. Although we wish it wouldn't, but it often does. So just, one good article, one question, and let them stew with that for a while. And then a week later, another article comes out, or you hear, see this, or if you're teaching a class, you've got wonderful opportunity, because there's all kinds of good stuff coming out in the academic world. And this can include I found TED Talks by Roland Griffiths, the head of the psilocybin team at Johns Hopkins. Wonderful introductions. He's exactly the sort of scientist that you would want to be doing psychedelic research, because he's so loving and humane. I mean, he's just the opposite of Sheldon Cooper on Big Bang Theory. Okay, so approach that way, and do it slowly. You're working. Don't hit them hard. Hit them easy.
Yeah, it's, walking your, we all know it, walk your talk and be who you want the world to be. The other is just find somebody you don't like and be nice to them. It's just a great practice. They also drives them crazy. Yes, way in the back.
Hi, Jim. Hi, Tom. Thanks, guys. I had two questions. I'm not sure if I can fire two off. I'll start with one. Are you aware of anyone who's microdosed with ayahuasca?
What's the other?
Well, acquiring psychedelics is a task in itself. Some are more straightforward than others, such as mushrooms. You can tell if it's real, it's good, you can grow them, they're natural. LSD is a little bit trickier, and I'm not even really sure how it's produced these days. Is it produced in labs, and before it hits the street? Are people?
And what's your question?
Question is, what are some of the pitfalls to avoid when looking for a source of LSD? And I mean, my ultimate question is how can I find some? But clearly, I can't ask that in this room, in this forum, especially when you're being filmed. So,
yes, you can.
Okay.
One is on our website. Sophia and I have looked at this question which we get, and our answer is all these drugs are illegal, and we're not going to give you any information. I sometimes add, do you know any college students? I now add, do you know about the dark web? See, if you want to know where drugs are available in this culture, it's college, high school, prison, and the dark web. Now, drugs that are bad for you, I actually don't know quite how to get those, but I gather one can. And the thing that I've found is fascinating is how quickly people who say, I'm living, in a white Protestant enclave in a suburb in the Midwest, and no one within 100 miles has had a psychedelic, how can I get some? And I say, ask around. And I often get within 3 days, oh! My favorite was a guy who wrote, and he said, you don't know me, you don't remember me, but I'm a therapist, I'm in a divorce, I'm in depression. And I said, well, you might try microdosing. He said, I have no possible way of finding any. I say, well, look around. A day later, I get a letter that said, I got a great deal on the dark web. So the other is, if God wishes to reward you by giving you a psychedelic availability, he or she will do that. And if you buy that, I got a bridge for you too. The answer is that it's a funny business, but this culture doesn't seem to have much trouble filling needs that people have. And because psychedelics are inherently not really dangerous if you know anything about what you're doing, it doesn't seem to be a major problem. And I appreciate your asking about different drugs, and the answer is, when you write a book called The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, you have to clean up your life so that if you're busted, you are clean. That is a reason not to write such a book. But I did, and I am. And it is one of the prices you pay in this particular world is you don't do things that are illegal, and you don't help other people do things that are illegal, but you can give hints. Because you're then reporting on what people have reported to you.
Ayet Wallman, in her book, A Great Day, is that another? Go ahead. Mentions that when she was looking for LSD, she found a dealer who offered her an enormous supply. And having worked as a defense lawyer, knew that this is one of the traps that the DEA use, because I would rather arrest you for a huge amount rather than a small amount. So if you're buying whatever and you get a chance to buy a big amount, I wouldn't do it.
Okay. Yes, yes.
So I have a question about microdosing. If you're going to use psilocybin, can you use it as a tea? And if so, how would you be able to gauge the dosage?
Well, I'm just trying to be common sense like a normal person, which is if I wanted to have a half teaspoon of sugar in tea, I would put the half teaspoon in a teaspoon first, and then I would put it in the tea. I would not just throw sugar in the tea and hope I could measure a half teaspoon. So if I wanted to put psilocybin in tea of, say, 0.3 of a gram, I would measure 0.3 of a gram of psilocybin and then put it in tea, and then drink it all. So I have a small cup. Now, I don't mean to trivialize that, but there's a kind of, that's when I say go look around or ask around. That's a question which we can handle without making a big psychedelic to do about it, which is measuring things is measuring things. And putting things in tea is a kind of normal, we have bags are measured and so forth. It's not a big deal. What I'm hearing is a lot of questions about microdosing. I recommend thethirdwave.com. That's one word, the third wave. That's Paul Austin's site. And Paul is the kind of next generation of how do we change the culture smart and carefully, which a lot of you have asked about. And Paul feels that microdosing is a very useful tool, and he has a whole sections on microdosing, and with lovely little diagrams and little, like little pictures of people and things. So, I appreciate these questions on microdosing, but understand that most of them are pretty kind of, if you just think about it, they're pretty easy to answer. And the things we don't know are esoteric drugs and so forth, and we also don't know lots about its uses for lots of things. This is exploration. You're kind of asking, it's like saying, Columbus, now that you're back, can you tell me, is there a good deli in 35th Street in Manhattan? And Columbus says, look, I just landed. I don't know anything about anything, but I know there's a lot of land there. And if a lot of people go visit it, maybe they'll find where there's a deli, okay? So we don't know a lot, and we're learning a lot, and you are the people who are going to be telling us about it, and I'm one of the people who's going to funnel that information into the media because that's one of the jobs, that I have. But I'm getting out of the microdose business in the next 6 months, if I can. So, thanks, and let's have no more microdose questions. The microphone is somewhere.
I was going to see if you had any comment about microdosing with cannabis. Is
I
that
don't. I don't.
Okay.
When you were, when you took those steps before you published the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide to sort of cross your T's, dot your I's about having a clean life, did post-publishing, did you see any undue attention, or did you see any blowback? Did you get audited by the IRS? Did any doors close professionally, or just any thoughts you have on that?
I don't know if any more doors could have closed professionally. Oh, but they did. I was hoping for groupies, actually. I would get, I'd do something in a bookstore and I'd be waiting for the groupies. And I'd get some 60-year-old guy that said, I took LSD 27 years ago and I want to take it one more time. Where can I get some? I thought, boy, you write a book and people think you're a dealer.
When can we expect to see a ballot initiative in any state about legalizing psychedelics? How close are we to that?
Wait, start that question again. I liked it.
How close are we to any state having a ballot initiative to legalize psychedelics? How close do you think we are to that in any state? I mean, why not?
I don't expect to live to see it. On psychedelics?
I mean, do you want me to put a time frame on it?
Well, like in the next, I'm 65. I'd like to see it in the next, 15 years, maybe.
I'm a lot older than you are, and I'm hoping. The question is what's going to happen in the next X years about anything, and the answer is a lot. And my only question is, what can I do right now? I mean, I'm getting really simple. It's like at the end of Candide, how do you handle life? You try gardening. And the nice thing about gardening is you really get, you get a lot of feedback. And you have to make a lot of moral decisions, like, are you a weed? Do you mind being pruned? I just want the flowers for the house. No, the aphids can't live here. There's a lot of stuff that goes on that you got to work with, and it's the same in the culture, which is, what am I going to do with psychedelics? What am I going to do with my time? And the answer is the best I can, and that won't be as good as it should be, and that's fine. And as one of the poets said, we are borrowed stardust. So if all life on Earth ends, the universe is really not going to matter. It's not going to get very excited. So we're clearly about done. Is there someone that has a question that has a kind of finality to it, where we can say something profound and get out of here?
I'm hoping so. The mind design, inventing new mind-body states and their resident abilities keeps coming back to me, and I'm wondering if either of you or both of you have an example of intentionally, consciously doing that.
He does.
Thank you.
I have students, or had students, who would combine LSD with other drugs, but I can't really think of a good. I mean, it's like cannabis or alcohol or something of that sort, because those are combinations of them. It seems to me that there must be some meditation, combined meditation research, but I don't know the meditation research. Do you know any?
Yeah, there's a wonderful study that was done in Switzerland using people who had at least 20 years of meditation experience with a particular zendo. And they did a sesshin, which is a week-long intensive. And in about the fourth day, they gave them psilocybin. They had a wonderful time. They didn't like sitting cross-legged quietly. And I don't know the rest of the results.
Oh, Johns Hopkins has a study with meditators too, and psilocybin. I don't know if they're still recruiting or not. You can go to their site and find out. Oh, if you want to find out good research, go to clinicaltrials.gov. I mean, that lists all kinds of research where you can just put in the words you want to find, you know, psychedelics or whatever. Clinicaltrials.gov.
Yeah, and why don't you make it a possibility of being in clinicaltrials.gov rather than looking for it? So it's been a little longer day than you might think. Remember, this is just the warm-up. You've got days like this. It's a beautiful day out. Within a block of here, there's at least one street with trees. There's a horde of wonderful, ethnic, inexpensive restaurants within a couple of blocks. It's lovely out. And we've been honored and pleased and delighted that you came and that you were as supportive and as open and as interesting as you are. And we will be seeing you around, and we are just very, very happy that this happened and that MAPS gave us the opportunity to do this. So thank you very much. Namaste.
Thank you.